pull up the sources now. We can start. One or two people might join us a little later, but all good. So let me make sure I have the right sources here. There we go. So because I'm trying to stay ahead of the game with my shiurim and drushot, etc., I'm not always preparing the parsha on the parsha. So it's very confusing to make sure I have the right parsha. But I remember back in the day when I was in yeshiva, they told the story that Rabbi Lichtenstein, the Rosh Yeshiva, one Shabbos he got up there and he gave an hour-long sicha, shmooze, whatever, on Parshat Noach. And it was not Parshat Noach. And he just got confused because he was preparing for Parshat Noach. You know, you prepare all the different Parshas at once. So he gave the wrong one. And the next day he got up and said, you guys weren't wrong. I was wrong. I'm sorry. So, thankfully, I'm pretty sure we're in Beshalach. I think I got this right. So we're going to start now with Beshalach.
Quit your
we mentioned that last week in Parshat Bo, we have the Jewish people, Paro letting the Jewish people go, as the song says. Bo, Paro let us go. And we looked a little bit in Parshat Bo. What do we look at? So does anyone remind me? Maybe because I'm blanking for a second. What section of Bo do we focus on together?
I know we talked a bit about, I think it was in this year. Maybe it was a different one. Paro, Hashem hardening Paro's heart.
That was the drasha. That's why I'm getting confused. I'm confused.
Okay, we're both confused.
Parsha here. Okay, well, whatever it was, the theme that we've been continuing throughout Vayera, throughout all Shemot, is this idea that a lot of what we're dealing with here now is a very important transition point for the Jewish people. There's the question of the identity of Jews versus Egyptian, slaves versus servants of God. There's a question of free people versus enslaved, etc. And I think that's really going to be an important question, an important facet, an important lens to look at the actual Yetziah, the actual exit from Egypt, the actual exiting from Egypt. So we're going to look at a little bit here today together, the Jewish people's actual exit from Egypt. They're leaving the land and Paro following after them. So we pick up here in Shemot Yudalid. Not a good sign that I don't remember which was the drasha and which was the shir last week, but whatever. It's good. We're all learning so much. We're confused when we learned what, but that's a good thing. So we have now in Shemot Yudalid, the Jewish people, as we referenced last week. Last week was about the lies. Why did Moshe have to lie? Why did he say that 3 days? Okay, now I remember. Great. And we said that part of the idea was the politics of it all, Paro trying to convince the Egyptians to get on board. All good. All right. So now, Vayikach sheish me'al rechav bachor, v'chol rechav Mitzrayim shelishim al kulo. So Paro goes and he takes 600 chariots filled with bachor, with young soldiers, and v'shalishim al kulo, with officers on all of them, and he pursues the Jewish people as they go to leave Egypt. That's what takes place in our parsha. Right before we get to the Shira, before we get to Az Yashir and the parting of the sea, we have Paro chasing the Jews. V'chazik Adonai et leiv Paro. God hardens Paro's heart, like Margie said, a reference to our drasha last week of God intervening and hardening Pharaoh's heart. And leiv Paro melech Mitzrayim, he hardens the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. V'yirdof acharei b'nei Yisrael, and presumably as a result, because God hardened Pharaoh's heart, Pharaoh and the Egyptians chase after the Jewish people. Whereas normally, or under different circumstances, perhaps Pharaoh would have said, you know what, I'll let them go. God hardens his heart, and Pharaoh decides to chase them. Ubnei Yisrael yotzim biyad rama. And the Jewish people left with a raised hand. Very interesting comment, description. I'm not really sure what to make with it. I'm open to other suggestions if anyone has any idea. But it's interesting that we have here this comment, the Jewish people left with a raised or with an outstretched hand, or with a high up hand. So if you look at the translation here, the Sepharia translation translates this, again, I assume it's JPS, but I'm not sure. They say, as the Israelites were departing, defiantly. They translate Yad Ramah not literally. It doesn't mean literally an outstretched hand. They say it means defiantly, which I think we can get like the metaphor or the imagery of it. The idea of like doing it with an outstretched hand is you're doing it so publicly, you're not shy about it, it's defiant. But I think something to think about, perhaps something we'll get back to, I'm not sure. But what exactly is going on here that this is biyad ramah? Why is there such an emphasis here on the outstretched hand? And more than that, I guess, really this, in my opinion, just begs the question of what exactly is the role of God up until this point. God told the Jewish people to leave. They go to leave. And the next thing you know, we hear about an angel, we hear about fire, and then eventually God tells the Jewish people to cross the sea, and we'll see that. But what role is God playing here? Is he defending the Jewish people? Is the angel defending the Jewish people? Is the fire defending the Jewish people? Is there fire? Is there an angel? We don't have so much details. We just know the Jewish people left, And now all of a sudden it's Yad Ramah. It's this defiant or open act. So we don't really know what that means yet. So just to note it here, we have this unusual phrase, and it's not really clear in context.
So we have also the metaphor of God's arm or hand, or the Zro and the Tuyah.
Yad Chazakah.
We have that again and again, and that's God's presence in some fashion.
For sure, which is a great point, but I think just emphasizes how peculiar this question is. Because if you look at the pasuk, it doesn't say the Yad Ramah of Hashem or God's hand was B'Yad Ramah, anything like that. It only mentions the humans, the Jewish people were leading.
Well, it was the picture that comes to mind. It's a very famous picture from the 1968, the Olympics in Mexico City. And African-American athletes raised their arm, and some of them had black gloves on, black power.
Like an act of defiance, you're saying?
Yeah, the Jews, they were slaves, and now they were
I hear that. I think that really reads into like how Safaria is translating it. The Yad Ramah literally means like a defiant hand or a defiant act.
So they were in the process of changing. It's going to take 40 years, but
yeah, I think that's beautiful. I also think it's that's a great metaphor. And in a similar vein, this idea that there is some sort of audience, that the Jewish people are being defiant so someone can see, so someone can notice. I think that's also very relevant to the Exodus story. We mentioned a little bit the idea that God is doing this to show the other nations, to show the Egyptians, to show Pharaoh, etc. So I think perhaps similar to like what you're saying too, that this is like a statement of defiance or something to that effect. Perhaps that's also what the Psukim are trying to emphasize.
Is HaKadosh Baruch Hu operating as the quintessential director, stage manager, and insists that Uvenei Israel Yotzim B'Yad Ramah?
Oh, exactly. That's great. It's a stage note. God is noting to us, by the way, you might be wondering, like, so what are the Jewish people doing, or how are they supposed to respond? They should be confident. They are confident and defiant. So this is all going to be important because it's going to play into what we're about to see, that the Jewish people were not confident. They did not seem defiant. They were super not sure that they should be doing this. So this is a great conversation. Now, this will all set the stage nicely for the what we're about to see, the action that's about to take place. So perfect. So Pasuk Tet now. Yerdefu Mitzrayim acharehem. So Egypt chased after them. V'yatzigu otam chonim al hayam. And they encountered them. They approached them. They trapped them, camping on the sea. Kol sus rechev paro. All of Pharaoh's horse-drawn chariots, ufarasha v'chelo, and all of the various entrapments and accessories that go along, and the whole army. Al pi achirot lifnei Baal Tzafon. On the mouth of Chirot before Baal Tzafon, where the Jews were. They all went there, the entire army, every chariot, everything, the whole works. Ufaro hikri, and Pharaoh himself gets close. Yisub bnei Yisrael et einehem, and the Jewish people lift up their eyes. Hinei Mitzrayim noseh acharehem, and the Egyptians are chasing after them. V'yiru ma'od v'yitzaku bnei Yisrael el Adonai, and the Jewish people were very afraid, and they cried out to God. So just to note a few things on this pasuk. So first of all, until we got up to pasuk Yud, until we got up to verse 10, we had no idea as the reader that the events that are being described weren't known to the Bnei Yisrael. The Jewish people didn't even know Egypt's chasing them. They only found out when the Pharaoh gets close enough that they can see. The pasuk tells us, "Ufaro hikri," Pharaoh got close. And then the Jews looked up and they saw Egypt and they got scared. V'yirumod, and they were very afraid. V'yitzaku, and they prayed. So first of all, just interesting to note the chronology, the narrative, the story and drama. Pharaoh amasses an army and starts chasing the Jewish people, but the Jewish people are still celebrating. They think they're all free. It's all good. It's unclear if Moshe told the Jewish people that God's plan was to go to Piachirot in order to cause a confrontation. We don't know if the Jewish people know that they're heading towards the Yam Suf. They're actively heading towards a dead end, looking for a fight. They're just following Moshe, and then all of a sudden they see the Egyptians are behind them. So what do? They call out and cry to God. And again, to point out one of the things that's been consistent in our study together of Shemot as we go through the Parsha, how do they cry out to God? It's not v'yitz palel, it's not, and they complain, v'yitz lonin, and they complained, but yitza'aku, tza'aka, screaming, calling out, a cry of distress and helplessness is a repeated verb throughout Shemot, throughout Exodus, that is how the Jewish people get God's attention. They cry out, they scream out. And we noted before, of course, that this ends up having a very specific connotation in the Torah. This word has a very specific meaning in the Bible, because it gets used to describe what happens when a poor person or a widow or someone disadvantaged in society calls out for injustice. It's a sa'aka when the poor call out. So interesting to think about how sa'aka is being used here. Yeah, sorry, did someone say something? Oh, okay, sorry, I just wasn't muted. So we'll carry on now. So the Jewish people lift their eyes, they see Egypt approaching, and they scream out to God. They cry out. What we don't hear, what we don't see, is the content of what they cry out to God. We just hear the cry out. Could be just a guttural cry, could be the content isn't what matters, the point is that they're crying out, but we don't have any content of the prayer. Okay, so they cry out to God. V'yamru Moshe. In addition to crying out to God, they also say to Moshe. So there's two verbs, two things going on here. There's prayer klape mala, up to the sky to God, and then there's the communication with Moshe. V'yamru Moshe, the Jewish people say to Moshe, Hamabli in kvarim b'Mitzrayim, lakachtanu lamut b'midbar. Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you're taking us out to get killed in the desert? Why did you bother to take us out of Egypt? And of course, it bears witness, it's striking how unbelievably chutzpahdik this is. God just performed open miracles in a way that he has never performed before, taken them out of the strongest kingdom, the strongest empire perhaps in the world, and now they're saying, oh, clearly you're a failure and we're all going to die. Very difficult to understand. But what we see is the beginning of a pattern that will characterize Moshe's relationship with the Jewish people, that will characterize how this first generation, the Dor Yotzei Mitzrayim, the generation that leaves Egypt, how they're going to interact with Moshe, with God, that they're going to go and they're going to complain, these extreme hyperbolic complaints. And it's not just hyperbole, but I think this touches upon one of the themes we spoke about before, that really part of the issue, part of the struggle here, is not just physically getting the Jews out of Egypt, but spiritually and culturally getting them out of Egypt. Divorcing them from the mentality of slavery, from a culture of idolatry, making them Jews and no longer Egyptian, breaking the slave mentality and the slave mindset. So I think part of what we get here is that mindset. Of course, it's unhealthy to say, I'd rather live with my captor than try to be free and potentially die. That's a horrible relationship, a horrible circumstance. But it's also a very typical one. It's just Stockholm Syndrome. It's a very familiar, relatable idea they're expressing. We'd rather the bad that we know than to the bad we don't know. We'd rather go back to slavery, as bad as it is, than take a risk and go into the unknown.
You know, Rabbi, what you're making me realize is we're talking about a people that have been traumatized.
For sure.
Really been traumatized. And
yeah.
So when you think of it in that from that human perspective, it's not so bizarre to be crying out to God.
Yeah, 100%. I think
and being pissed off at Moses.
I think trauma is the key to understanding the entire Moshe Jewish people relationship in the desert. How can they be so stubborn? How can they be so hard-headed? So we all know that as a Jewish people, we're stubborn and hard-headed. That's our legacy. But whatever, tough-necked, as the Torah tells us. But in addition to that, I think it's exactly like what you're saying. That there's real generational trauma here. They're dealing with the trauma of hundreds of years of slavery. You don't just wake up one day as a free person and be fully able to actualize yourself. So part of what we're seeing here with these ridiculous, outlandish complaints is this lingering trauma from slavery. I think that's spot on. And I think that perspective, that idea that the Jewish people here are giving us our first taste of what's to come. They're giving us the first taste of the complainers who complain about the man, they complain about the Slav. We're getting a preview of the relationship that's about to come. And that relationship is really characterized by their Egyptian trauma. I think that's for sure true. I think that emphasizes the problem we're about to reach. That all feeds into the difficulty in this passage. Yeah, was someone about to say something before I go on?
Yeah, do you think that they complained while they were slaves in Egypt? Do you think they were complaining in their own home, or do you think maybe they couldn't? And
so that's a really good question.
The next 40 years to get all the complaints, not all the complaints, begin the complaining they couldn't do for the past 210?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I haven't seen a midrash or anything that discusses that, but I think that the essence of what you're getting at is like a really good point. Like even if their complaint is a byproduct of trauma, like the fact that they're vocal enough and standing up for themselves to complain is itself also a step towards breaking the shackles of slavery, of being independent, of being empowered. So it's also like an interesting point to note that, like, of course it's bad they're complaining against God and against Moshe.
There weren't enough graves in Egypt, you had to bring us out here?
Yeah, it's an outlandish thing to think of, right? Like, of course things are better off here than they were before. But yeah, I think it's a great point. Maybe it's something to do about like that slave mentality and how they relate to complaining. All right.
People
Yeah,
are,
Joel.
oh, sorry.
No, Joel, what were you saying?
People who are traumatized often go back and forth. They're very they take it too much, or they're too they just take abuse they shouldn't take, or they go the very opposite and they become abusive in some cases, and they go back and forth because it's an issue and they really don't know how to react appropriately. So back and forth, and it can last for years and years, sometimes
sure.
for a lifetime.
Yeah,
It
for
did
sure.
last for 40 years. It lasted for 40 years until the majority of them who left,
Exactly.
the age group, were no more.
Yeah, exactly. It lasted for 40 years over and over again. This is a cycle that repeats because this metaphor, or maybe not even metaphor, maybe literally true, this perspective of trauma is like very informative to understanding like what's about to come, for sure. Cycle over and over again. All right, so good. So all of this, though, is really going to emphasize the question that we're slowly building towards here. The Jewish people are traumatized. They say, are there not enough graves in Egypt? Didn't we already talk about this with you, Moses, in Egypt, saying, stop, leave us, just let us serve the Egyptians and leave us alone? Because we told you, we said, go away and leave us alone. We would rather serve Egypt than die running away in the desert. The Jewish people invoke their initial skepticism towards Moshe. We told you we don't want none of what you're serving. We ended up following you, and now you're going to kill us. So again, following into this complaint, this outlandish lack of faith. Moshe responds to the nation, Al tira'u, do not fear, hityatzavu, stand tall, uru'u et yeshuat Adonai. See God's salvation. So Moshe responds to the Jewish people's complaint, and he's not angry at them, or at least he doesn't express anger here, like we see him express later on in the Torah. But he also doesn't legitimize their complaints at all. He doesn't say, oh, you're right. He doesn't say, let me go talk to God. He says, oh, what are you talking about? Everything's fine. Stand strong and have faith. Faith is all that's necessary. So we see that Moshe's response to prayer is to criticize it. He says, why are you praying? Why are you calling out? Why are you worried? Just stand where you are and have faith and know God will protect you. And Hashem, see God's salvation. Asher yaseh lechem hayom, which God will do for you today. Ki asher v'item Mitzrayim hayom. For as you see Egypt today, lo tosifu lerotam od ad olam. You shall never see Egypt like this again. That's what God says. God gives them a promise.
What?
Really, Moshe gives them a promise, but presumably approved of, agreed upon by God. But Moshe promises the Jewish people, you will never see Egypt like this again. You will never be intimidated. You'll never be threatened by them again. So trust me, it's worth it to break away. Trust me, freedom is worth it. Carry on. Hashem yilachem lachem, God will fight for you. Atem tacharishun, and you will be silent. So just to review, the Jewish people are being chased by Egypt, freak out, call out to God, complain to Moshe, and Moshe says, what are you doing? Just carry on, God's got your back. Now we go to Pasuk Tetvav, and this is the question, this is the crux of what we're going to discuss together. Pasuk Tetvav, verse 15. Vayomer Adonai al Moshe, God says to Moshe, Ma titzak elai. What are you crying out to me for? Daber al bnei Israel vayisau. Talk to the children of Israel and tell them to travel forward. God turns to Moshe and he says, why are you crying out? Anyone want to ask a question? Does this strike anyone in some way unusual, peculiar?
To me.
Moshe doesn't cry out. We never see Moshe cries out. The Jewish people are the ones who cry out. The Pasuk says very explicitly in verse 10, Pasuk Yod here, V'yitza'aku b'nei Yisrael al Adonai. The Jewish people complain to God, and they'll cry out to God, and then V'yumru Moshe, and then they complain against Moshe. Clearly, the Jewish people are on one side. Moshe and God are on the other side. They're complaining or crying out against Moshe and God. But God turns to Moshe, and he tells Moshe, why are you crying out to me? Moshe didn't cry out at all. What do you mean, why are you crying out to me? But I want to go one step further even, and we're going to explore this together. But one step further, even if Moshe did cry out, what kind of question, what kind of statement is this from God? God's angry that people are praying to him? oh, how dare you pray to me? Why are you praying to me? What? Isn't that what we're supposed to do? The Jewish people are facing their first ever crisis since being freed. And the first thing they do is pray. Even before they complain to Moshe. Before they complain, they call out to God. Isn't that amazing? Isn't this so commendable? And God's response is, what are you doing? Why are you talking to me? Stop it. It's so strange. It
Clearly,
seems so out of place. Yeah, sorry, is someone about to...
clearly God hears this as a lack of emunah, a lack of belief, not paying attention to all the nisim and the flout that have happened.
So that is going to be our key question for tonight, and Paul is putting forward one interpretation. So the key question that I wanted to explore tonight is how to understand God's response to this moment. What is God and Moshe, what are they talking about right before they split the sea? Why is God so critical of of the Jewish people's prayer, of Moshe's prayer, etc.? What is going on here? So for that question, one approach put forward by Paul, and Paul is pointing out the pshat. Just the most simple understanding seems to be, clearly God thought it wasn't enough. He thought that you shouldn't have prayed because you should have had emunah. And really what this passage is about is it's a very particular sort of unique type of message. Because in general, if you have a life crisis, of course you should pray. Of course you should seek leadership. You should go to Moshe, to a rabbi, to a spiritual person. You should pray. You should seek God, all those things. But in this very specific instance, after 10 plagues and all these open miracles, and after God proved himself to the Jewish people, in this instance, it was ridiculous that they prayed and didn't just trust God. That's what Paul is putting forth, and I think that's, to some extent, the pshat. That God, the simplest way to understand this is just God is saying to the Jewish people, why don't you trust me yet? How can you not trust me? I've done so much for you. Keep walking. So I think that's one possible interpretation, and Paul, I totally agree. That's the simplest interpretation. That's the pshat, and I think it's very strong. So I'll just note though that a couple problems with the pshat is that, first of all, as pointed out, there's still the problem of God addressing Moshe and not the Jewish people. So it's not the biggest issue. Maybe God is just telling Moshe to deliver this message over to the Jewish people, but it's just a little peculiar because in general, when God is speaking to Moshe as a messenger, we know God tells Moshe, tell this to the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. But God doesn't say, tell the Jewish people, why are you crying? God says to Moshe, why are you crying? Tell the Jewish people to travel. So it seems like Moshe is somehow culpable. Moshe is somehow involved. So that definitely challenges a little bit this more simple understanding. The other thing I'd push back against, and then I'll open I hear some people, I'd love to hear what people think, but the only thing I'll push back against personally is that I also don't find that the most compelling, because even after all of these miracles, I don't know if prayer is ever a bad thing per se, right? It didn't say they complained against God. The Torah has a whole language and verbiage of when the Jewish people do something bad, when they complain against God, v'mitlonein against God. But that's not what they did, right? They did tza'aka. Tza'aka is actually generally pretty good in the Torah. Tza'aka is what you're supposed to do. Tza'aka is like our model of like prayer. So again, it could be that even though tza'aka and prayer and all this in general is good, in this very specific instance, they should have had faith. And I think that's a legitimate model. But I want to try and pursue some other explanations that maybe can understand why Moshe is the one who's being addressed, why Moshe is the one who's being held culpable. And maybe if we're lucky, can even tie all of it together to explain larger what is going on in this section. But for now, we have one very legitimate, very good position that what's going on here is that the Jewish people should have had more faith, and God is essentially telling the Jewish people, have more faith.
Could it also be trying to establish Moshe as a leader, and wanting people, wanting to put that kind of role, make him fulfill that role, and this almost looks like the going to the boss behind the supervisor's back type of thing?
So Margie is putting forward a brilliant idea that I want to build to and we'll have the entire share culminate in. That what we're noting here, what the Torah is telling us here, is not a question of when is it right to pray or when is it not right to pray, but rather it's a question of Moshe's leadership. And part of what we're getting here is a strategic decision by Moshe, that Moshe is saying, you know what, let me take this to the big boss or something to that effect. And really Moshe as the leader, he's responsible for his constituents. So he's the one being blamed for his constituents crying. God is upset at him. And he's the one who has to deal with it with the big boss, with God. He's going to go and fend for them. And really what the Torah is telling us is that Moshe is going to God and saying, you know what, I might not have been the one to cry, but I stand with my people. I represent my people. I'm going to go to the boss. I'm going to go to the authorities that be and try and talk to them for them. And, if they did something wrong, I'll take the blame. If things go well, I take the credit, that's leadership. You're the one who makes a difference. You're the one who makes an impact. Then Margie, is that like a pretty accurate description of what you were suggesting?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I think that's a great idea too. I think, and in fact, I think that's something we're about to see to an extent expressed in Rashi. So if we get to source 2 now, amazing.
Moses delivers exactly what God would want him to deliver to the people. He said, you wait, you will see how God will rescue you.
Yeah,
he delivers the message perfectly.
Exactly. It's not just that Moshe himself isn't scared. It's literally like the perfect response. Like if God himself were to respond, you would think it'd be the same thing, right? Yes. It's like very strange, even if we want to take these a little bit of a stretch explanation, like, oh, Moses represented the Jewish people, whatever it is, how is he being met with anger by God? That is very surprising. The matitzakalai, why are you crying to me? Very, very surprising. So, unsurprisingly, all the commentaries, all the rabbis realize how strange this pasuk is, and they all go to town struggling with the difficulty we have and offering variations of some of our suggestions. So very similar to Margie's suggestion, Rashi quotes a midrash, a mechilta, and his first answer, his first explanation that says as follows. So we look in source number bet now, source number 2, Rashi. Ma titzakalai, why are you crying to me? Limdanu shahaya Moshe omed mitpalel. So we learn from here it must be that Moshe was praying. Says Rashi, we have this problem that the Jewish people pray, but God says Moses stop praying. It must be Moshe also prayed and the Torah just didn't tell us. So that's how Rashi gets around it. But why? What's the significance of that? Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said to Moshe, Lo eit ata laharich b'tfilah, she'yisrael netunim b'tzara. Now's not the time to pray because the Jewish people are struggling. So, and okay, fine. So this isn't like Margie. The second answer, Rashi's like Margie. We'll get there. But basically, the first answer is more or less that Moshe started praying when he saw the Jewish people praying. And like Paul said, that's also a lack of faith. And Moshe also had this lack of faith. It was a time for action, not a time for prayer. Why didn't you have enough faith to take action? So that's Rashi's first answer. Seems to solve some of our questions. The only difficulty is you have to assume that Ikar Chaser Min Sefer, the most important thing, isn't written. That Moshe started to pray. God's angry at Moshe for praying, but the Torah forgot to tell us that Moshe prayed. A little bit strange. So possible one explanation, but very difficult in the text. Davar Acher, Rashi now brings a second interpretation, and this is Margie's. Ma titzakelai, why are you crying to me? Alai hadavar taloi v'lo alecha, k'mo shneimar lahalan, al b'nai v'al pol yadai titzamuni. God is saying to Moshe, you let me worry about my children and not you. In other words, Moshe didn't actually pray, but he represents the Jewish people, and he's going to God, taking the interests of the Jewish people, and he's making a case. Moshe went to God and said, listen, this isn't in the interest of the Jewish people. And what does God say? You're telling me what's in the interest of my people? In other words, the problem here is not the tza'aka. It's not the cry or the calling out. It's really the alai. Like, yeah, this is a stressful situation. You should be worried. You should call out. But you're going to call out to God? You don't just trust God. You're telling me that this is a problem? I'm the father. I'm the king. I'm the ruler of the Jewish people. Trust me. I'm invested in their well-being, and I know that this is a problem. Who are you to turn to me? So the second answer seems to be saying that Moshe is trying to represent the Jewish people and convey their anxieties to God, even if he himself doesn't have them. And God's response, essentially, is even that's illegitimate. You don't even have the right to represent the Jewish people when they're so concerned, because you should trust that I'm going to be as concerned as you are. I'm their father. I care about them. So we see that we have these two approaches in Rashi. The first is like what Paul put forward. The problem here is a lack of faith. And really, Moshe too is subject to a lack of faith. Moshe too doesn't praise and doesn't have enough emunah. That's the first answer with its whole host of weaknesses, Ikar Chaser Min Sefer, etc. The second answer is that Moshe didn't actually pray himself. He was merely representing the Jewish people. But God was so angry that Moshe even had the gall to represent the Jewish people here. He didn't just immediately say, go and take action, that he told Moshe, you think you care about the Jewish people? Trust me, I care about them enough. I also just want to point out this latter answer is a little bit difficult because it sort of defeats the purpose of Moshe ever praying to God. Like, we know Moshe successfully prays to God multiple times, but like every time, why doesn't God just respond, oh, you think it's bad for you? It's so much worse for me.
Where's God coming from? I mean, what, God wasn't aware of the fact that that Moshe was telling the people, wait and see, have faith?
Exactly, right? Like, God doesn't know what Moshe said already? Why is he criticizing Moshe? Moshe did everything right. I totally agree. The challenge with all of these answers, whenever you're going to try and say, Moshe didn't lead the people well enough because he didn't, he didn't pray, or he did pray, or whatever. But what? Like, we saw the best answer. He said, Hityatzvu U'Re'u. Beautiful language. Stand and see God's salvation. So I think we're going to be very skeptical, very critical of any suggestion that ultimately concludes that really what happened here was that Moshe just didn't have enough faith. So that's what we've seen variations on so far. So let's keep going in that approach. We'll point out some slight variations on it, and then hopefully, in the vein of Margie's suggestion, we'll get to the real answer here.
Is it that Moshe didn't have enough faith, or is it that God's saying, I need action now, I'm going to do something, prayer isn't enough now?
I think that's the difference between maybe the first and the second answer. Yeah. Like, the first answer is just like, why are you even questioning me? Like, have faith. Whereas the second question, the emphasis is more saying, like, stop wasting your time worrying about them. God's already worrying about them. Use your time to actually solve the issue and tell them to keep traveling. So I think that's a good distinction, but I think that's possibly, expressed in these different approaches we're trying to develop here. Okay. So all that now takes us to the Ibn Ezra, to our third approach we're going to put forward, which again is just a slight variation. And as we all know, the Ibn Ezra is one of the earlier commentaries, very early. 11th century gets quoted by the Ramban, and the Ibn Ezra, much like the Rashbam, is a Pashtan. He focuses on the simple meaning, tries to keep things as straightforward and simple to the text as possible. Mm-hmm. So that just in general important to know, but particularly when we get to these issues where clearly the text just seems to be missing some relevant piece of information, particularly interesting to know who's a Pashtan, who's focusing on textual proofs, and who's a Darshan, who's focusing on rabbinic literature, themes, outside sources, looking for their answers. So that brings us to Ibn Ezra, our Pashtan, looking at our text here. And the Ibn Ezra says in source Gimel, Yesh Omrim, some say, He Moshe hayatzoik al Hashem. Some say Moshe actually did pray and cry out against God. And we saw that answer put forth as the first answer in Rashi. V'zeh inenu. And Rashi, this answer is wrong. V'zeh inenu nachon. That's not right. Kikvar diber lo ve'chabda b'faro. Because, and it can't be right. It can't be that Moshe is going and crying out to God, because God already warned him that this is the plan. Because if we remember from an earlier shir, God told Moshe, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart so he chases you. Moshe knew that Pharaoh was going to chase the Jewish people. God literally already told him. So why would Moshe cry out and pray that the thing God told him is going to happen is happening? That makes no sense. Fine, the Jewish people don't know. You didn't hear from God personally that they're going to go on a wild goose chase just to wipe out the Egyptian army. But Moshe knows this already. No way, no how. Moshe was afraid. No way Moshe was praying. So, what is it? What's going on in the pasuk? Rak Namar of Moshe, Shu Keneged Kol Yisrael. Rather, it just says Moshe, because Moshe is the leader of the Jewish people and he represents all the Jewish people. He's Keneged, he's equivalent to, he's a stand-in for the entire nation. But Moshe Tzaku b'nei Yisrael El Hashem, because the Jewish people cried out to Hashem. In other words, it's not at all that Moshe himself is culpable, but God is addressing Moshe just because Moshe is the one who represents the Jewish people. That's the answer of the Ibn Ezra, that God is actually criticizing the Jewish people. He's not criticizing Moshe. And really, Moshe did nothing wrong here. I'll just point out, and I don't even have to point this out. If this works for you, great, but I think we all saw them stuck together inside. Certainly, this is a weak interpretation textually. God says in Pasuk 15, V'yomer Hashem Moshe, God says to Moshe, Ma titzak elai, why are you, in the singular, crying to me? Daber al b'nei Israel, you should be telling the Jewish people to travel. In other words, Moshe is at fault for praying instead of delivering the message of travel. It's not just that, the Jewish people aren't traveling. It seems to be implying that Moshe's fault, part of what Moshe did wrong, was not telling them to travel. What does Moshe tell them? Hityatzvu u're'u. Stand stationary. Stand where you are. God is telling him that's the wrong thing to do. For sure, God seems to be criticizing Moshe here. The only question is he also criticizing him for praying? So it's a little bit of a stretch here to read the Ibn Ezra as saying, well, yeah, Moshe did nothing wrong, and God is just criticizing the Jewish people, and Moshe is the fall guy for the Jewish people. I'll also just add, there's tons of times where God criticizes the Jewish people, and he doesn't criticize Moshe. He doesn't criticize Moshe after the golden calf. He doesn't criticize Moshe when they complain about the mun. So why all of a sudden, the first time, Moshe has to take the blame, but every other time God's able to differentiate between the leadership and the constituency. It's not the strongest answer. So we're still left with this issue. How do we understand our section? Why does God get angry at Moshe and say, Ma titzak alai, why are you crying out to me? So that now takes us to the Ramban, to our fourth option. So just to review quickly, we saw Rashi had one answer, which reflects Paul's approach, the Pshat here, that in this circumstance, you should have had more emunah, you should have had more faith. So even though prayer is generally a good thing, here prayer is not a good thing. Okay. And Moshe prayed himself, and it's just not mentioned in the Torah. That's the first approach. Second approach is Moshe conveyed the prayers of the Jewish people to God, and God got angry at him for taking it upon himself to worry about the Jewish people and not just trusting that God himself worried about the Jewish people. So here, it's not a lack of emunah, it's not a lack of faith that God will do something, but rather it's perhaps like a presumptuousness. Like, Moshe, why are you praying? Don't you know I already care about them? So that's the second answer. We said that's a little bit similar to Margie, that Moshe is talking not because he believes it or because he did anything wrong, but as a leader, he's taking responsibility and conveying the Jewish people's complaints to God and taking the fall when ultimately God gets angry. Then finally, the third approach we saw, which is similar but a slight variation, says Moshe did literally nothing wrong, and God is just formulating it towards Moshe because Moshe represents the Jewish people. Moshe's just going to go and give the criticism over to the Jewish people. It's not like Moshe himself did it wrong, but it's just the formulation. And we pointed out that that's very atypical to what we usually see in the Torah. So that brings us now to the Ramban, to our fourth answer here. So it says the Ramban, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, not Eliezer, sorry. Amar Rabbi Ezra, Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Eliezer, Elazar Ibn Ezra, fine. He quotes the Ibn Ezra. So he opens up and saying, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, the Ibn Ezra says, sorry, I got a little confused there, Ki Moshe keneged kol Yisrael. That Moshe is lav dafka doesn't really mean that Moshe is to blame. It means the whole Jewish people are to blame. Sheyatzokim lo, because they're crying out to him. K'mo sh'amar v'yitzaku b'nei Yisrael Hashem, like it says, they cried out to Hashem. Vim kain lama amar ma titzak alai. But if that's the case, and Moshe himself didn't cry out to God, why does God say, why are you, Moses, crying to me? Or even the Jewish people, why are you, the Jewish people, crying out to me, rather? They should have cried out. It's a completely legitimate time to cry out. In other words, it says in Ramban, if it's true that like the Ibn Ezra said, that really what's going on here is that Moshe is just conveying the Jewish people's messages, but Moshe himself isn't experiencing a lack of faith. So what's the problem? Of course the Jewish people are scared. They're being chased by the biggest army in the world. Moshe himself knows everything's fine. Okay, so he's just going and telling God, the Jewish people are scared. Like, what are we going to do? That's not an issue. So why is it that God is so outraged by the Jewish people's prayers if it's legitimate for them to pray, if it's legitimate for them to be afraid? So maybe what God is saying is not that he's angry, not that it's wrong to cry out, but rather that it's just not productive to cry out. What are you going to comfort? What are you going to accomplish? Nothing's going to happen if you let them cry and scream and freak out. Moshe, as the leader, you should be calming them. In other words, according to the Ramban, this isn't actually a theological scene. It's not that the Jewish people get to Piachirot, they get to the Yam Suf, and they say, oh, we have no faith in God, let us be slaves, this was all a lie. It's that it's fear. It's basic human fear, it's chaos. They're freaking out. So says God, you're not helping them by coming to me and saying, oh, well, I'll talk to God about it. Don't do that. You should be confident. You should go and you should say, God's got this. I got this. We're all good. Calm down. Just keep traveling. The problem is that Moshe gave in to the fear and said, you know what, stand and let's wait around a little bit. I don't really know what to do. He should have said, keep traveling, go through the river, go into the Yam Suf, we'll figure it out. So that's the approach of the Ramban here. That the problem was that Moshe, or not exactly, but the problem was, as he says here, not that it was a wrong, that it was a sin, that God's angry per se, but rather that it was ineffective. That what is it going to do? Is it going to comfort anyone? What are you going to do? Oh no, I totally read that too late. I'm sorry. Sorry. I skipped ahead a little bit. Maybe what God is saying when he's upset at Moshe and saying, why are you bothering to do this? It's not going to do anything. What he's saying is that I already warned you that I'm going to do this. Okay, sorry. I jumped out a little. So the Ramban's first answer is that maybe what's going on here is not that God is saying that it's bad or it's wicked or it's evil, but really what's going on here is God is saying, how can it be? We're not even at the answer yet. I'm so sorry. We're at the question. Ramban's setting up the question. The question here, it's hard when I know the answer. I'm trying to fit in time. I'm skipping to the answer before we present the question.
You're doing great. Don't worry.
Thanks for the positive encouragement. The Ramban's question here, and we're getting this right, is our question. How can it be that God tries lahanichim to placate or to reprimand, to respond to Moshe by criticism? How can he be criticizing Moshe? Why are you freaking out and praying to me? How is this seem possible? God already warned Moshe this was going to happen. So how could it be that Moshe is praying? How could it be that God is reprimanding him? None of this makes sense. Moshe should be confident. God should be angry. What is going on? So Rabbeinu Amru, our rabbi, said that Moshe told George, just a reminder to mute.
Hello? Jenny?
George.
George, a reminder to go on mute.
You don't call anymore. What happened? You don't
We all have to mute ourselves, guys.
Yeah, just a reminder. If anyone wants to claim the hostship,
If somebody got the host, they can mute.
Rabbi, whoever's host, you can mute.
yeah, I actually don't have the host code.
Who's host, Jeff?
I think just the Stanton. Okay, I think we're good for now. So in the future, though, make sure that we're meeting, and I'll make sure that we get the host code before we start class in the future. Okay, so the Ramban asks our question. All this is just the Ramban asking our question. Sorry about that. Rabbeinu Amru, he quotes on the Chilta that Rashi quotes, and he gives Rashi's answer. Rabbeinu Amru, Shaya Moshe Tzolik Mitpalel. Our rabbi said that actually Moshe really was crying. V'hu nachon, and it's correct that Moshe was also crying out to God. Ki lo yada ma yaseh, because Moshe didn't know what to do. Va'af al pi she'amar lo Hashem v'chavda b'faro. And even though God told him that this is all going to happen, hu lo hay yodea eich yitnahei. He still didn't know practically, effectively, how to lead. So sorry, I skipped because I knew what the Ramban was going to say, but this is our answer again. It's not that Moshe didn't have emunah. It's not that Moshe didn't have faith and did something sinful, but it's that Moshe just practically wasn't being an effective leader, and God is saying that is not effective. It's not effective to turn to me and start praying. The Jewish people are just going to be worried. They're just going to freak out. They're going to say, oh, wow, even Moshe doesn't know what to do? How are you doing this to them? Tell them everything's okay. Keep walking forward. That's what God, that's how the Rabban understands it. The problem here is that Moshe is praying instead of reassuring them. So the problem is not that Moshe himself experiences a lack of faith. Moshe has total faith. He knows everything's going to be okay. It's just he doesn't know what to do. So he says to God, like, give me advice. Like, what's the most effective thing here? And God responds, how could you think asking me right now, while the armies are chasing you, while you're in the most dramatic, stressful moment in the world, telling the Jewish people, stand around while I ask God and find out what's happening. You think that's the answer? No, of course you should say, everything's fine, keep marching. So again, this answer of the Ramban only makes sense, is only predicated if you really pick up on the distinction we made between hityatzvu, Moshe's command to stand still, and God's insistence on vayisa'u, on traveling. In other words, Moshe did give a good response. Moshe said, God will protect us. Wait till you see Yeshuat Hashem, God's salvation. But he also told them to stand still and wait around while he figured out what to do. Because he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to lead. So he waited around and he asked God, what should I do? That's the Ramban's answer. So we see a slight variation, but very similar. Moshe himself prayed also. Not mentioned in the Torah, but Moshe himself prayed. So similar to that answer we saw put forth in Rashi. And why did Moshe pray? Not, God forbid, a lack of faith on Moshe's part, but rather inexperience. That Moshe panicked, he didn't know what to do, and instead of saying travel forward, he said, maybe I should check in with God. And this is an important message, an important scene in teaching Moshe's independence, Moshe's leadership training, etc. That's not the case. That's not what he should have been doing here. He should have been maintaining calm and pushing forward. So that's the answer of the Ramban. So we've seen so far 4 answers. So I'll just, broadly speaking, I think there's 3 broad categories we've seen. One category to our question says, Moshe really did pray. Moshe prayed with the Jewish people, and what we get here is criticism of Moshe. But the criticism of Moshe is because he had a lack of faith. He shouldn't have been praying. How could he pray? That's the answer put forth in the Midrash, put forth by Rashi, etc. The second answer is Moshe really did pray, but he didn't pray out of a lack of faith. He prayed out of panic, not knowing what to do. That's the answer of the Ramban. Very similar, slight difference. Slight difference being that we don't have to bite the bullet of assuming somehow Moshe didn't have faith. Much easier to think Moses, the newly appointed leader, doesn't know what to do, then it is the thing Moshe Rabbeinu, our leader, wasn't sure God was going to protect the Jewish people and wasn't sure that God could pull it out. So slight variation, a little easier to swallow. Then finally, our third answer that we saw developed is that Moshe didn't actually pray himself, but rather the Jewish people prayed, and Moshe is just the conduit, and God is speaking to Moses as a means of speaking to him. So now I just want to point out that every single one of these answers is very difficult, and I might even say weak. Of course, it's extremely difficult to say Moses prayed when he didn't in the Pesukim. The verses don't say that. The Torah doesn't say that. In fact, the Torah goes out of its way, as we pointed out, to show Moshe didn't pray. He told the Jewish people, stop praying and be confident. So hard to accept that Moshe prayed when it's not in the Torah. And even if you say Moshe didn't pray, and he's just representing the Jewish people, then why does God criticize Moshe? Why doesn't he criticize the Jewish people? Why is it targeted towards Moshe? Very difficult. So to try and understand this, I want to look not in our Parsha, not in this section, but a little bit forward. We have this story of the Jewish people approaching the Yam Suf. That's our story we read together. Then, of course, we know ultimately the Yam Suf splits, the sea splits and they cross it, and the Egyptians are wiped out. And we have a chapter of Az Yashir, this beautiful poem praising God. The narrative isn't forwarded, but we have a poem. But immediately after,
We have complaints.
the next story, exactly, Lindy, we get complaints. We get complaints, which is an enactment or really an expression of this warning we see here, the Jewish people's very first complaint. We get complaints. And this is the story that immediately follows narratively, chapter-wise it doesn't, because we have a whole chapter of the Song of the Sea. But narratively, this story follows. So we have now in chapter 15 here, Vayisa Moshe et Yisrael Yam Suf. Moshe travels or leads the Jewish people from Yam Suf. They get to the desert of Shur, and they travel 3 days and couldn't find water. Excuse me. They came to Mara. They couldn't drink the water there because they were bitter. That's why they called it the bitter place, aptly named. And now here we have not v'yitzaku, vayilonu ha'am. The nation complains. The verb we find repeated over and over again, mitzlonanim. The nation complains, negative connotation. Vayilonu ha'am al Moshe, lemor ma nishteh. The nation complains to Moshe, saying, what are we going to drink? Vayitzak el Adonai, vayoreu Adonai eitz, vayishalech al amayim, v'yimteku amayim sham sam l'chok mishpat, v'sham nisahu. So Moshe cried, so to take it piece by piece, Vayitzak el Adonai, Moshe calls out and cries out to God. Vayoreu Adonai eitz, God shows him a tree, a piece of wood. Vayishalech al amayim, he throws it into the water, v'yimteku amayim, and the water is sweet. And now we have a very strange phrase, Sham sam lo choku mishpat. There he gave him law and order, or law and another form of law. V'sham nisahu. And there he tested him. Unclear the appositives. Who's testing who? Who's giving what to who? Seems the pshat is God is doing it to Moshe. God gave Moshe choku mishpat. And God tested Moshe. Where's that coming from? What's that mean? What's the test? What does choku mishpat even mean? We know that Rashi, quoting Chazal, say that choku mishpat is actually a reference to halacha. That certain halacha, certain mitzvot were taught there. God taught the Jewish people about Shabbos, about Para Aduma, certain random mitzvot. Very strange midrash. Why would that be? Why would that be the case? How does that have anything to do with the story? The story is the Jewish people escape, just leave Egypt. They're so thirsty, can't find water. They complain to God. God shows Moshe how to solve it, and they get water. What's that have anything to do? It's so strange that has anything to do with Para Aduma, anything to do with learning the halachos of Shabbos. So what does Sham Sam L'Chok Mishpat V'Sham Nisahu mean? Carrying on, Moshe says, if you listen to the word of God, you do what's right and just in God's eyes, and you follow God's mitzvot. God is saying this to Moshe rather. All the badness that I, God, did in Egypt, I will not do to you, for I am Hashem your healer. So God says, after Moshe throws the branch into the pool and makes all the water sweet, God says, I'll never hurt you like I hurt Egypt because I am God your healer. That's the conclusion of the story. An extremely cryptic story and a very strange way to start off the 40 years of the desert. We have the Jewish people complaining again. We have Moshe going to God and asking God for what to do. God telling him to throw a stick into the water, and then this bizarre phrase, Sham Samla Choku Mishpat, Sham Yisa. So, I want to try and solve the peculiarity of this story, the peculiarity of our story, solve it all together. And I want to suggest as follows, and we'll see if you guys agree, if you guys think I'm crazy here. So, we pointed out that notably, the Jewish people freak out and cry as they're being chased by Egypt, and Moshe doesn't. Moshe turns to them, and Moshe says, stand and wait for your salvation. And there we noted, how did the Jewish people cry? What's the verb? Vayitza'aku. They called out. And we noted that this actually gets a lot of play in Shemot, because it seems, at least in Exodus, if not in the whole Bible, that is the verb for legitimate, need-based prayer to God. Sa'aka, crying out to God. So the Jewish people cried out, a legitimate cry out to God. Fascinatingly, what do we see in the story of Mara? What's the verb the Jewish people use?
The Hitler name.
The Hitlonain. The Jewish people are just complaining. This is a completely legitimate request, of course. They need water, but the way in which they're doing it is not legitimate. What does Moshe do when he receives this request? Vayitzak el Adonai. In the story of Mara, Moshe is the one who does tzaka. In other words, we have a story before Yam Suf, where the Jewish people are praying to God and crying out, and Moshe says, don't worry, stand there and be chill, be confident. Then we have a story after Yam Suf, where something bad happens and the Jewish people freak out, and Moshe goes and prays. I think what's going on here, and the pshat of how to understand this, is that we have an example of Moshe's first failure of leadership. That at the Yam Suf, what should have happened, the right thing to do, was to pray. The Jewish people are of course right to pray. Like the Ramban asks, how could this even be an illegitimate time to pray? This is the most legitimate time for prayer. But rather than capitalizing on this, rather than Moshe seeing, oh my gosh, they're praying on their own, let's start the religion, let's go, I'll lead them. Let's take this spiritual energy, this religious energy, and build on it. Moshe says, whoa, what are you guys doing doubting God? How can you doubt God? Go, go, stand and see God will save you. And Moshe is critical. In other words, Moshe, the confident leader leading the Jewish people, gets so caught up in the mission, so caught up in the confidence and the faith in Hashem, he misses the leadership opportunity. He misses the chance to teach the Jewish people how to pray, to lead them in prayer, to be there with them, and to understand that it's okay and it's legitimate that when you're afraid, God should be a part of that moment with you. You should call out. You should cry out to God. In other words, Moshe's failure here is dafka that he doesn't pray. It's so noteworthy, it stands out in the text that the Jewish people are praying and Moshe isn't, because that is his sin, that is his mistake. He should have joined them instead of reprimanding them. That being the case, and this is my most controversial take maybe in all of the Torah, so feel free to disagree with me, I think the only way we can explain, the only way we can understand ma titzakilai is sarcastic. Because Moshe doesn't cry out to God. Moshe doesn't talk to God. In the immediately preceding verse, there's no communication between God and Moshe. Why does God suddenly start talking to Moshe? Where does that come from? I think God is interjecting. God sees Moshe reprimanding the Jewish people for praying, and he says, oh, prayer's too good for you? What, you're not going to pray to me? Ma titzakilai? Oh, no need to pray to me. I'm just God. You don't need my help. You apparently got this. Keep on traveling. In other words, I think God is upset that Moshe is not modeling behavior of prayer, faith, and commitment. Now this, I think, is corrected at Mara. That is why we needed Mara. Why the first thing the Jewish people need to experience is a crisis, so Moshe can make up for it and show them how to act in crisis. Because in Mara, what do we have? The Jewish people complaining and sinning and doing the wrong thing. But this time, the first story after the Yam Suf, what do we see? This time Moshe does perform tzaka. Moshe does cry out. This time, Moshe actively leads the Jewish people and gives an example, demonstrates how to have a relationship with God, how to be spiritually in touch with your needs, and in a moment of crisis, in a moment of need, that is legitimate, and it's a good thing to turn to God and to cry out. Moshe makes up for his sin and models true leadership behavior here. So I think what we see here of the story of Matzah is a story of Moshe's first failure of leadership and his first lesson that sets the precedent for the rest of the desert time. That if we're going to be in this cycle of trauma, as we talked about, the cycle of complaint and punishment, Moshe has to be able to handle that. The rest of Shemot is all about complaints. It's just the Jewish people complaining to Moshe and sinning over and over again. If Moshe can't handle this, he's doomed. So the first story we get as they leave Egypt, the first role model Moshe has to learn is how to lead by example. And here the way he leads by example is by praying when it's appropriate and not being so foolhardy, so quick to action that he just takes action without speech. Now, I just want to point out that it's a little bit fitting that this really preempts or foreshadows Moshe's ultimate downfall. What is the sin that leads to Moshe's downfall? He's really quick to action, really quick to hit the rock, but a lot slower to talk to it, a lot slower to prayer. Now, Moshe is a man of action, but as he himself says, he has a lisp. He's not a man of speech. So you get sort of like a microcosm here of the trauma, the drama, the tension of the Moshe character. Moshe is a great leader, but he has to get over his own self-defeating tendencies, his own self-doubt, his own anxiety and urge to just hit the rock, to just push forward, to just say there is no problem and just keep going, to really understand his people, to hear them, to legitimate their concerns, and then to say, listen, why don't we pray together? Why don't we seize this together? So now I know we're over time. I just want to try and prove this because I think it's so beautiful.
This place is wonderful.
It's such an out there idea. I know it relies on reading a pasuk a little sarcastically, which is always difficult, but I just think it's so beautiful because this peculiar phrase, Sham samlo choku mishpat v'sham nisahu. There God gave him law and judgment, and there he tested him. So what does that mean? It's really bizarre, right? But what's amazing is that this phrase appears 2 other times in Tanakh, exactly as it is this bizarre phrase. First, it appears at the very end of Sefer Yehoshua, after Yehoshua successfully brings the Jewish people to Israel, divides the country, and fully takes over the mantle of Moshe as being the leader of the Jewish people. Then what do we find out about about Yehoshua? Vayomru ha'am el Yehoshua et Adonai Eloheinu na'avod v'kolo nishma. The Jewish people pledge allegiance to Yehoshua as their leader and Hashem as their God. They're in Israel, conquering the land, pledging allegiance to God. Mission successful. V'yichrot Yehoshua brit la'am b'yamahu v'yasim lo choku mishpat b'Shechem. And Yehoshua signed a treaty with the Jewish people, and he gave him choku mishpat in Shechem. Right. So one way to read this is that Yehoshua gave the Jewish people choku mishpat. But I think what choku mishpat means, it doesn't mean a specific law. It doesn't mean the laws of Shabbos, the laws of Paraduma. I think it means the authority of the law, legitimacy as a leader. God gave Moshe legitimacy as a leader when he proved himself, when he showed he was prepared for the next 40 years. There's going to be 40 years of complaining. Moshe's up to the task. He learned his lesson. Now he's able to model proper behavior and handle the complaining. Yehoshua only becomes a leader at the end of Sefer Yehoshua. That's when he lives up to the promises of Moshe. He actually gets the Jewish people into Israel. He starts conquering the land, and he makes a covenant. Just like Moshe had a covenant right before they entered Israel, Moshe has his own, treaty or terms of how he leads, of how he interacts with the Jewish people, and how they'll be bound to the Torah he delivers to them. Yehoshua has a covenant, and Yehoshua's covenant also is capped off by recognition of Yehoshua as the leader. Sham samlo choku mishpat. There, God gave Yehoshua the authority of law, the power of legal authority to back him. Finally, we have one more time, and just to point this out, Radak here on Yehoshua says, "V'yasim lo choku mishpat, perish lo la'am," so gave to the nation. So v'nyano k'mo sham sam lo choku mishpat, shesider lehem derech klal chukei haTorah u'mishpatim. So the Radak himself ties this to the sham sam lo choku mishpat of Moshe. And he says, just like Moshe was the figure who gave over law, who gave over halacha, Yehoshua now is the figure who's giving over laws and halacha to the Jewish people. So we see it's some sort of ascent into authority. And of course, if that's the case, if Yehoshua is a role model, a leader who embodies Moshe, who is the only other figure in Tanakh who rises to that level? Ezra, the leader who leads the Jewish people out of exile back to Israel for the final time. And so too by Ezra, we get the lineage of Ezra. We find out how he's born. And the introductory thing we learn about Ezra, who Ezra? This is Ezra, source 6, Alam Bavel, he went up from Babylon, who sofer mahir b'Torah Moshe. He's a sofer, he's greatly qualified. Okay, fine. And Ezra got and convinced this large group to go up to Israel. They got to Jerusalem, so Pasuk 8, Pasuk 9. because on that date, it was the day where they established themselves. Ki Ezra hachin levavo lidrosh et Torat Hashem. Ezra prepared his heart to be doresh, to seek out God's Torah, ula asot, and to act, ula lamed, and to teach Israel in Israel, chok umishpat. The same phrase, chok umishpat, the laws and the rules. So I think that this connection, that every time we have the initiation or the kickoff of a leader, of a Moshe-like figure, of a transmitter of Torah, of a major leader figure in the Jewish people, we have a moment of chok umishpat, a moment where they need to be endowed, given God's authority, the authority of Torah, the authority of law, and they can only do that when they rise to the occasion. So much like Ezra only rose to the occasion when he convinced all the Ole Sion to finally return to Jerusalem, much like Yeshua only rose to the occasion when he finally entered Israel and divided up the land and began to conquer it, we see in this week's Parsha that Moshe only rises to the occasion when he learns from the mistakes of before the Kriyat Yamsuf, learns from his overconfidence, learns from his criticism of the Jewish people, and realizes that sometimes you don't have to charge into action. It's okay to turn to God and pray. It's okay to have a little bit of tzedakah. So Moshe is our role model for that, and he has to learn that the hard way. Hopefully we can all learn that lesson from Moshe and not have to learn it the hard way. So I hope that makes sense. Feel free to disagree, to call me, text me, email me, follow up however you want. I admit that it's a big claim making. I'm claiming that we can read a couple words a bit rhetorically or sarcastically, but the least I would say is I don't think the bullet I'm biting is any bigger than any of the bullets any other Mefarshim bite. I don't think it's any harder to read my read than it is to say, oh, Moshe actually really did pray, but they forgot to say that in the Torah. So we're left in a situation with no good answer. Sorry, what were you saying?
I was saying it seems to be expanding the understanding that chok umishpat is literal but figurative. It's about leadership, followership, as well as policies and procedures for running a nation.
Exactly.
I mean, if you look at Moshe is a human leader, doesn't this story make sense?
Yeah, exactly. It's a beautiful story because it shows us that even Moshe has to fail before he can learn how to lead.
Just one other question, Rabbi.
For sure.
Does the concept of Maseh Avot Siman Labanim apply here?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful idea as well. What do you mean in terms of Moshe in the previous?
I mean, always hear that terms in terms of what happens to the forefathers or lessons for us in all future generations. But can we expand it to beyond Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov?
That's a great point, and this is actually something that gets talked about a lot in Parsha and literature in general. That there's this idea that Paul is invoking called Masa Avot Siman Labanim. The stories of the forefathers are symbolic for the children. And in Midrash, in the rabbinic language, that's actually, as Paul is pointing out, a very narrow tool. That tool says that the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's 12 children, they all individually repeat certain things. So Abraham goes to Egypt during famine, Isaac has to leave town during famine, Jacob has to leave town during famine, etc. Very specific, very narrow. But over time, the literature and the liturgy, the tradition, has exploded that very narrow term to be like a principle or philosophical point. That because of the consistency and continuity of Jewish tradition, Jewish history, whatever happens in the past is doomed to repeat itself to some extent or can be learned from in the future. So I think this is a beautiful example of that as well. An example of Maseh Avot Siman Labanim, that Moshe has to learn how to pray, has to learn how to calm down and talk a little, reflect a little to be the right leader. So hopefully we can all take that Maseh Avot to heart.
Yeah.
All kavod.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.